And it's a non-trivial technological problem. You know, it's now possible for young men to look at more beautiful nude women in one day than any man has ever seen, you know, prior to 10 years ago, 20 years ago, than any man in history had ever seen. That's not nothing. That's something. And to think that doesn't do anything to you, it's like, no, that likely does something to you. So don't substitute the false for the real.
I think pornography is a serious issue. And because of the way that it taps into these very primitive systems, it's as serious in my mind as some of the other drugs of abuse, like the opioid crisis. Right, so I was starting to get a lot of questions. I was kind of surprised. I thought, well, you know, I'm male and, you know, maybe that's why they feel comfortable asking. But people were saying, you know, I'll just be direct about it. They were asking whether or not masturbation was bad. They were asking whether or not masturbation with ejaculation was particularly bad. And here's my stance on this. I'm a biologist and a neuroscientist, not a psychologist. But what we know for sure is that if an individual repeatedly engages in this circuitry, let's say masturbation and pornography, with increasingly potent forms of stimulation that are on a screen, a couple of things happen. First of all, what's being reinforced? What's being reinforced is a high dopaminergic response to watching other people engage in sexual behavior, which is very different than being in a first-person sexual experience. Okay, so right there, you know that what's being reinforced is not actually any kind of improvement in communication skills. It's voyeurism. And as these questions started to come in more and more, I started to realize there was a lot of kind of undertones of people talking about fear of or experience with sexual dysfunction that clearly pornography can lead to. And here I'm specifically talking about males. I actually don't know the literature on females. Without getting into a huge discussion about that, the point is this. Masturbation and pornography are potently tapping into the dopamine system and can undermine the very processes of what I consider healthy processes of finding a mate, you know, dating, communication, eventually, if it's appropriate, sexual interaction,
etc.
Like
it's undermining pair bonding.
With no judgment whatsoever, right? I'm not here to, it's not a moral thing. I'm just talking about what I do is I look at things through the lens of biology, and in particular through neuroscience, but some other fields as well. We have to take a step back, and now knowing what we know about testosterone and dopamine and all these things, and ask, you know, what is pornography doing to the brain? Well, first of all, it's triggering the release of dopamine, and in the short term, testosterone, by the observation of sex, not actually engaging in human contact. So think about the young brain being significantly more plastic and willing to rewire than the adult brain. Absolutely, there's no question about it. It's hyperplastic.
Yeah.
And of course it can rewire again, but you think about somebody who engages in a lot of porn watching, right? Watching porn, and that person is getting dopamine and testosterone increases by observing sex and not actually by engaging in human contact, okay? So that's concerning, right? And obviously the people vary, but it should come as no surprise that a lot of these people have trouble with romantic interactions when they do happen, right? Because their brain isn't conditioned to respond to those, right? But also dopamine seeking is what triggers the increase in testosterone. But as we just talked about it, with repeated dopamine seeking or triggering of dopamine release, it starts getting diminished. So pretty soon that behavior is not causing the release of testosterone. Now people are just doing it compulsively to try and get some little droplet of dopamine out of their brain. I personally think that porn and the availability of porn is a real detriment to the developing brain, especially to the developing brain.
Yeah.
And it takes some discipline, right? I imagine, and it's one of those things that it's also anxiety-less compared to dating and relationships where people are vulnerable on both sides and have to negotiate things like, you know, consent and timing and, you know, and communication and all the things that are really hard to do but are essential to do. That's key. So I think pornography is a serious issue, and because of the way that it taps into these very primitive systems, it's as serious in my mind as some of the other drugs of abuse, like the opioid crisis. And you think about what porn and masturbation, these things really are. I'm not calling them sinful. What I'm saying is they are potentially addictive, especially with the availability of pornography. So, beware, just everyone's different, and people have to be careful about these circuitries. You really need to protect them.
And that's partly how an addictive sub-personality can grow too, right? Because you can imagine that there's a certain state of mind that you're in. Maybe it's a state of something approximating nihilistic hopelessness that grips you every time you're motivated to seek out your favorite drug. And that's fairly far back in the activation chain, but it's there every time you take a hit. So what happens is the dopaminergic reinforcement produced by the drug reinforces that nihilistic hopelessness that drives the drug-seeking behavior.
That's right.
And that's how, in part, you develop a monkey on your back.
And so I would say, in keeping with our theme of what are the other things to do to support testosterone, would be don't engage. I would avoid pornography, frankly. I really would. I would, maybe everyone's got their threshold for what's too much. For some people, that might be, the number might be 0. I think that what's healthy in this domain has never really been defined. This is one of the challenges. We know what an eating disorder is, but what's healthy eating, right? Mm-hmm. Where do you draw the line? I think given this general theme that relationships are healthy, friendships are healthy, romantic relationships are healthy, and anything that inhibits the pursuit and functioning of healthy relationships is where you have to start saying, wait a second, is this behavior getting in the way? So look, it's unlikely to be an all or none, I think, and I don't know what the line is, but we just have to be careful. Anytime we are overwhelmed with powerful images of increasing intensity, that's where you start getting into the dopamine depletion. Mm. That's where you start getting into the hormone depletion that we're talking about here.
So I have a real question about that, Jordan Peterson, Dr. Peterson. So you mentioned pornography. So what I've noticed that happens sometimes is because of years of watching pornography, the men's sexual attraction becomes warped. And so how can a man whose sexual attraction to women has become warped to the extreme ends due to so much consumption of pornography, how can that man go back to now being attracted to, more natural looking women, or more women that could be around their lives instead of the projected?
Well, deprivation is helpful.
Yeah.
So I think it's reasonable to assume that there's a novelty edge in pornography, like there is in so many quasi-addictive phenomena. And so it has to become, because novelty is a sexual kick, it has to stay novel, and that means that over time it's going to become more extreme. So that's not good. Well, so how do you resensitize yourself in some sense? Well, you stop. And then hopefully you recover. And then you deprive yourself of that outlet, let's say. And you might say, well, is that absolutely necessary? And maybe there's nothing wrong with pornography. It's like, well, I don't know, man. Like, have you ever really met a guy who is proud of that? Like, you know what I mean? That makes him feel like, I'm the guy, man. I'm watching pornography and getting off. It's like, what a man. I don't believe anyone feels that. And to me, maybe I'm wrong. And to me, that's an indication that, yeah, we know. No, it's pretty cheap. It's cheap. It's easy. And, I say that knowing that I believe the research evidence shows that if you introduce pornography into a community, that rates of sexual crime committed by men upon women actually decline. So there is perhaps some utility in the outlet. But, that's a unidimensional analysis and doesn't take into account all the other effects of pornography. So, including the ones you described. And I think that those are real. It makes sense that they're real, because it's super satiation. And it's a non-trivial technological problem. It's now possible for young men to look at more beautiful nude women in one day than any man has ever seen, prior to 10 years ago, 20 years ago, that any man in history had ever seen. That's not nothing. That's something. And to think that doesn't do anything to you, it's like, no, that likely does something to you. So don't substitute the false for the real. And don't underestimate the utility of deprivation. You know, what do we need to drive us forward to have the adventure of our life? You know, well, some deprivation, that's for sure. That heightens desire and drive, and maybe you need that. You're afraid to approach a woman. Well, you remove part of your drive with pornography, and so now you don't have that sexual urge to overcome that anxiety, and so you stay timid for your entire life. You know, maybe not, but maybe.
And then what's cool about that too is there's a Pareto principle issue associated with it. So if you can find out where the person can start, it isn't linear progress, it's exponential progress forward. And so even if they have to start at a micro level, it doesn't really matter because they get much better at it very, very rapidly as they accrue successes.